The second poet you're going to hear from today is John Matthias, who hopefully will not need much introduction tonight. Emeritus Professor at Notre Dame University, editor of the Notre Dame Review, fellow at Clare Hall, Cambridge, and with a 40-year trajectory of a poet behind him. Now, he's also just recently published a Shearsman volume, this constitutes the launch, I suppose, in the UK of this volume, Who Was Cousin Alice and Other Questions. Because another aspect of John's career as a writer you may not be so familiar with is that not only is he a fine poet, but he's one of the few people around who actually writes really entertaining literary essays. Those of you who are academics, forgive me for 1 second. Academics tend not to write the kind of essays I want to read as somebody from the common public. John is one of those people who can do that, and all too often it seems difficult for people to move across the divide into speaking to the community. John's essays are thoroughly entertaining even when they're deeply serious literary essays, but there's some wonderful personal essays in here as well. Last year we also published Trigons, a long poem that John wrote, and I'm pleased to say, starting later this year, we begin the publication of John's collected poems, initially in 3 volumes, the collected shorter poems in 2 volumes, and a collected longer. And we start with shorter volume 2, probably in October, November, if we can get it out in time. And the rest follow next year. So he's really a Shearsman author now. Welcome John Matthias.
This is an eclectic and strange volume. It's got poems in it, and it has autobiographical prose in it, and it's got literary essays in it. Diana and I met when I was over as a Fulbright scholar in the 60s at a party that neither of us intended to go to, and she said, why don't you, my roommate, and I come back to my sister's flat? And we did, and I was expecting a student flat of some kind. She didn't say my sister's flat, she said my sister's house. I was expecting a student flat. And this, some years later, suggests what I stumbled on when I stumbled on her extended family. Some letters. In the end, it was his daughter who would write the book about his mother. And Wayland fended off biographers for years after academics on the trail of Robert Falcon Scott trashed her on their way to the pole. It was 1980, and I lived that year at Clare Hall in Cambridge with my wife, half-sister of Liz, wife of Wayland Young, Lord Kennet. Wayland had been Hilton Young at first, like his father, Lady Scott's second husband, but he scrapped the Hilton part when he joined the Labour Party at the same time about that Wedgwood Ben had smashed the Wedgwood, saying, "You can call me Tony." Anyway, Wayland phoned one day and asked if I would go identify myself at the UL archive and bring him something to the Lacket, a small cottage in Wiltshire where Lytton Strachey had written Eminent Victorians, I think. Sometime after Wayland's father, the first Lord Kennet, had proposed to and been refused by Virginia Woolf. He wanted the letters, deposited by him on extended loan, that T.E. Lawrence wrote to Lady Scott after she became a Hilton Young and T.E.L. became a Ross and then a Shaw. Or was it Shaw and afterwards Ross? I showed them my ID, an Indiana driver's license, and they gave me a large envelope with all the letters. I said, "Can I just walk out with these?" The librarian said I could, being Lord Kennet's representative. So I took them to the station and caught a train for Wiltshire, reading in astonishment Lawrence's account to Wayland's mother, then a sculptress keen to do his bust, about his changes in identity and habits. At one stop, I got out, Xeroxed all the letters, and caught another train. Lawrence of Arabia, or Shaw, or Ross. He wrote to Wayland's mother, T.E. Lawrence is no more. Wayland's mother, too, had changed from the days when Scott would dine with her at luncheon parties that included Barry, Beerbaum, Isadora Duncan, Gertrude Stein. Peter Scott, Wayland's half-brother, had been named for Peter Pan, a work written not in Wiltshire at the Lacket, but at Wayland's London house on Bayswater Road. You may have seen the blue historic plaque affixed above the door. When I got to the Lacket, Wayland told me that another biographer had been in touch and that he'd grown wary, thought he'd better see what TEL had written before granting access to the file. I gave him the originals and sat there having tea and thinking about Lawrence, Scott, Strachey, Barry, Beerbaum, and Virginia Woolf. After a while, Wayland leaned over and passed me something. My driver's license, it appeared, had been slipped by the archivist in among the letters. Our eyes met for a moment, and I suddenly remembered all those photocopies I had made coming down. Better burn those. But I smiled and took the Indiana license, another cup of tea, a scone with marmalade, and said, "Lawrence of Arabia, good God." And Wayland said, "Yes, a very strange little man." Well, if that sounded like name dropping, this poem is written to my plumber back in South Bend, Indiana. And if that one's very much a London poem, this one is very much a South Bend poem. The Plumber. I think it must have been Auden who said that it's not even a contest between the plumbers and the poets. Should you think for a moment and ask, which breed has brought to civilization the most? Noodlers of Apollo or the sons of Aquarius? Plumbers win hands down. Think of the running open sewers of medieval towns. Think of the flooded basements, the outhouse in the woods, even in my grandparents' day. "Gardy-loo," they'd shout in London as they tipped the piss pot out on passers-by. Although I found it picturesque, to pump the water from a well at summer camp, I thought the sulfur tasted infernal. And older and elsewhere, I might have nodded in agreement with the engineer of Pompey's aqueduct when he knew before all others that something dreadful was afoot, answering a call from some Roman grandee en vacances who bitched that his water smelled like hell. Jeff, I've called you out both day and night for everything from leaking pipes to plugged up drains for something like a quarter of a century. When the upstairs tub crashed through the ceiling, landing in the downstairs sink, you rebuilt my house. The water ran again. We drank, we bathed. Shall I paint you in heroic terms? Why not? The hero is a man who saves you from a situation where you cannot save yourself. When the great boiler in our 100-year-old house, a boiler just as old as the foundation, began to shake and rumble like a nuclear power plant in meltdown, you shouted through the basement door, "Get the hell upstairs," and then came down yourself and did your magic just before you told me later it was going to burst. I once told you, I think, about a famous woman poet reading poems at Notre Dame, about the boyfriend she dumped, that included the line, "And anyway, you were a bad plumber." Nothing worse than that, she implied. As she read on in her poem, everyone could hear the nun in the first row suddenly saying, "Oh!" and giggling as she finally got the joke. That was part of a conversation I remember well after another problem had been solved, and we chatted over beers about one thing and another, and you praised for the first time, as you have many times since, the traditional crafts. You're no sentimentalist, so I won't say you got all misty over that, but I could sense your solidarity with carpenters and potters, electricians, stonecutters, maybe even poets. Although there's no real analogy between the infinite and delicate descent of the great Aqua Augusta and, let us say, measures in the prosody of Virgil, some hopeful poet still might want to force it anyway. I myself heard Tony Harrison and Robert Lowell talk all night about heroic couplets, at dawn agreeing that their favorites were in Dryden's Aurangzeb, where lines hold their own with the pouring of whole rivers. The talk had been so technical, Tony later said, he felt that he and Lowell had been two plumbers at their trade, measuring dimensions and materials of 1,000 pipes, fitting them for use. I don't know if I can borrow use in any way from you for what I do, but I know from observation of your efficacious labors all these years that when you say the water will run here, it does. Okay, I'll stop.